Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I may have your attention, please continue to enjoy your lunch. I'm Edward Geregian. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and I warmly welcome all of you to this special event we have today. Ambassador Westmacott, Consul General Miller, members of the Consular Corps, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's truly my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Baker Institute for an important conversation today on the current challenges facing the international community. Of course, there's no shortage of challenges at the start of this new year. Instability continues around the Middle East with the tragic reports of devastation in Syria on levels previously unseen, the threat of a nuclear Iran, the stalemated Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, all plus more calling for international leadership and global engagement. Broader challenges on long-standing issues such as global economic development, health, climate change, as well as more recent ones such as cybersecurity, cyberspace, and cyber governance will also require increased international leadership and policy attention. All of this, of course, painfully, while the federal debt in the United States and the Eurozone crisis compel decision makers to prioritize very serious domestic economic concerns. These challenges cannot be addressed without strong leadership on the part of the United States and Great Britain, based on the shared values and the traditions of our very historic relationship. Today's speaker plays an essential role in this partnership. He is a career officer in the British Foreign Service with over 40 years of experience in posts including Tehran, Ankara, Brussels, Paris. He assumed office as Her Majesty's Ambassador to the United States in January of 2012 and has worked to strengthen British-U.S. collaboration on the issues of defense, development, trade, investment, and innovation. Ambassador Westmacott has also championed a special relationship between the United Kingdom and Texas. Now, let me make the point, not as an independent republic, but as part of the United States. Visiting the Alamo and the Johnson Library last February and Austin's inaugural Formula One U.S. Grand Prix in November. As the ambassador has noted, British innovation in energy, health, defense, and information technologies has been a strong partner in the Texas business and academic communities. So I'm very pleased that the Baker Institute also and the larger Rice community here at Rice University have played a role in this collaboration. Our fellows in science and technology, Dr. Neil Lane and Dr. Kirsten Matthews, with the support of the British Consulate General in Houston, the Consul General is here, and the British Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, work with scholars in the UK to study policy towards stem cell science and climate change. In the past 3 years, 5 Rice University students, 2 of which worked here at the Baker Institute, have received the prestigious Marshall Scholarship for graduate study at universities in the United Kingdom. These scholarships will develop the next generation of scholars and statesmen with deep appreciation for British-American cooperation. They are also a testament to the wisdom and strong ideals at the foundation of the British-American relationship enduring. So we will continue to meet these pressing international challenges and do it together. So we are honored to have a distinguished statesman serving at the heart of that relationship with us today. Please join me in welcoming Sir Peter Westmacott.
Well, Mr. Ambassador Geregian, thank you so much for those kind words of welcome. It's very exciting to be here on, I think, the first anniversary of my arrival with my wife, Susie, also here in Washington, D.C. at the beginning of our assignment. I think it was either the 11th or the 12th of January that we arrived, and there's no better place than to celebrate the first anniversary here. It is indeed the case that I am Her Majesty's Ambassador to the United States, But you do prompt me, Ambassador, to think back to a conversation I had with Governor Perry not very long ago, when he said to me, Peter, I want you to be here to celebrate the 170th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Texas. And about 170 years ago, you did indeed establish your own embassy just next to a wine bar, Berry Brothers, which is still there in St. James. And at some stage, the governor and I, I'm sure, are going to commemorate that extremely important moment. It's also very exciting to be here in Houston in this university. You mentioned Marshall Scholars. We are very proud of our Marshall Scholars scheme. It's the British government's way of saying thank you to the United States for all the support you gave us in the Second World War, for the Marshall Plan as well. And we send 35 of the best and the brightest of the scholars that we can find from across America to the best British universities each year. And it's about the only bit of British government spending in the Foreign Office anyway that is rising, is the amount of money we put into that. And we're very, very pleased when we have Rice University scholars who win those scholarships. I think we've had about 25 so far since the beginning of the scheme, and long may that continue. It's very exciting. It's a great place to be here, and I'm very pleased also that my stepdaughter, who is an alum of your university and works here in a law practice, is also part of our link to Rice University. So there's lots of very exciting and good reasons for being here, and in a city, if I may say so, which was recently ranked by Brookings Institute, I'm told, as the best performing city economically in the United States, and ranked by Forbes magazine as the coolest city in the United States. Austin still claims to be the weirdest city in the United States, but that's a little place down the road, so we don't need to take that too seriously. So we've got all sorts of very important links here, and when one Charles Elliot, the very first British ambassador to the Republic of Texas, came here, to whom did he present his letters of credential but to one Sam Houston, of considerable renown, and whose role in public life we celebrate every day that we're in this city. So thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here, and I'm very proud to continue a tradition of British ambassadors coming and talking to the Baker Institute. I've been asked to say a little bit about challenges facing the international community at the beginning of the new year. And my God, I could go on all day if I was honest and exhaustive in looking through that list. But I think I should begin by saying something about the international economic situation. I think that is the biggest single problem which does confront us, and one can look at this from all sorts of different angles. Perhaps because I've been living in Washington, D.C. recently, probably the first thing is just you have to mention Fiscal Cliff, which has now moved on and be replaced by some other deadlines. I think this week's Economist, it was said that can kicking had become a transatlantic sport, and I'm afraid we've only bored ourselves 2 or 3 months before we got into the next round of deadlines called debt ceiling, sequester, and our dear old friend continuing resolution. So if we don't resolve all of them, I think the world's economy, as well as the United States economy, is going to remain in some difficulty. And yet, still on that subject, if the United States, and if the United States Congress in its wisdom, if those fantastic political institutions which you created with such efficiency to ensure that never again will the people of the United States be subjected to the tyranny from which you suffered in the 18th century before you... If all those marvelous institutions could do their job properly and come together in the national cause, at a time when we've got underutilized capacity, we've got the cheapest money we've known for decades, we've got low cost and masses of energy available here in the United States and elsewhere, maybe even in shale gas underneath the beaches of northwest England. There is an opportunity to get this right and to start heading into the sunlit uplands of economic growth, which, if it could begin here, the rest of us, the rest of the world, would be eternally grateful to the United States. But I think one can be optimistic. It doesn't have to be a muddle. And at the moment, alas, in all of our countries, it is, for all the reasons that we know. And I think what used to be called in shorthand Fiscal Cliff, but is now all those other issues, do provide one of the keys to fixing those problems. But there's plenty of others. We Europeans have got our role in trying to solve the difficulties of the global economy. We've got the Eurozone, which is in some difficulty, the United Kingdom not a part of it, but as interested as any member of the Eurozone in seeing those problems resolved. Half of our foreign trade is with the rest of Europe. We are right next door. We are part of the European Union. It's just that we and 9 other of the 27 members of the European Union are not actually members of the Eurozone. But we have the same interest in seeing the uncertainty resolved, in seeing the more vulnerable members of the Eurozone being properly ring-fenced so that if they've got difficulties, it doesn't have to be contagious. We have the same interest in seeing fiscal integration coming along with the degree of political institutional integration we've already got, and we need to see the banks recapitalized and all those other things which we've been talking about for some years and which in Europe we haven't yet got in the right place, even if there's progress and even if we've got global markets beginning to feel a bit more positive about that and feeling that we're heading the right direction. We in the UK, in the context of this global economic uncertainty and difficulty, I think have a particular responsibility. On the 1st of January, we took over from the United States as chair of the G8, a group of industrialized countries. We're working hard on our agenda for that. We're going to be giving priority to trade liberalization, to global measures to ensure proper tax compliance, and to developing greater transparency in development work. We want to see the G8 come together. We've got a big summit in June, which will be held in Northern Ireland, when we want to see the G8 show leadership in all these different areas and see whether we can do our bit together to kickstart the global economy. And it fits with a number of initiatives that we're trying to take on international development. My Prime Minister, along with the presidents of Liberia and Indonesia, has got a role as co-chair of a panel set up by the United Nations to look at the next set of Millennium Development Goals. What are we going to do about the world's poorest countries? How do we take forward development assistance and the right set of development policies? And he's developed something which he calls the golden thread, which is more transparency, more accountability, less corruption, institutions that are durable, proper respect for rule of law, property rights. In other words, a series of things which are necessary in addition to money, which are hopefully going to be the key to some of the poorer countries getting out of the difficulties which they now experience and becoming full paid-up members of the international global economy. Not just because we think that poor countries need help, but because we have a self-interest, we all do, in ensuring that they become more prosperous and they become markets for our goods and destinations for our investments. And I think that's very important development work, because as poverty and as gaps between the very rich and the very poor get wider, it's bad for the global economy as a whole. And so we need to see these countries not become failed states, not become more impoverished, but become more prosperous. And that's what we're going to try to do. And in the meantime, apart from money for the Marshall Scholarship Scheme, the one other bit of government expenditure which continues to rise in the UK, despite a really tough fiscal austerity program, is our overseas development expenditure. And we are committed to and we are implementing the target of 0.7% of our GDP being spent on development assistance by 2015. So all that stuff on the development side fits together with what we are taking very seriously in terms of our G8 responsibilities. We are also looking at the state of the global economy, looking at the absence of public money in the coffers to stimulate growth. We're looking at ways which are less expensive in terms of trying to create prosperity. I think it was one of the British post-war politicians who observed with brutal honesty, we've run out of money, so we better start to think. And that's still true. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to get going more global international trade. The Doha round of international trade negotiations didn't get anywhere. We are now pushing with a number of our European partners for the launch of an EU-US free trade agreement negotiation, which we would like to think would start this year. There's a high-level panel of United States and European experts going to pronounce on this in the next few weeks. And the simple calculation that the economists have made is that without throwing public money at it, if we could simply lower the existing tariffs, get rid of the restrictive practices, develop more mutual recognition of qualifications, help to set international standards, that the Europeans and the Americans between them could add 2 to 3% of our GDP, and between us we are half the world's GDP. So that would be quite a prize if we could get those negotiations going and, more important, bring them to a successful conclusion. So that's a priority for us. We'll push that through the G8, but of course it depends on all the member states of the European Union, and it depends on the United States. And we have been very encouraged by the messages we've been getting from the Chamber of Commerce, from organized industry, from organized labor, from trade policy experts, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. I think everyone seems to think that this is a good idea, and one of the few things we could do which would help get the global economy out of the difficulty in which it now is, if we could make some substantial progress. Linked to all that, more trade and more investment and reducing the barriers, I think, is the importance of us working together on some of the other cross-cutting issues. And I know that here at the Baker Institute you've done some very important work on cyber work, on the cyber threat. Cyber is, of course, about national security, but it's also about business competitiveness. It's about competition. It's about protecting intellectual property. And so I think very important for those of us who have companies and intellectual property, and of course a great deal of that is British and American, but also European more widely. We must fight to protect that against those who are using cyber attacks to steal our secrets, obtain unfair advantage, but also potentially set up the risk of national security threats to our critical infrastructure. So I think that's almost part of the prosperity and trade agenda. So plenty of challenges there, I think, under the heading of global economy, which fits together with trade and financial stability, cyber development, and so on. And I think we're going to have our work cut out. I think that the signs of us being ready collectively, Europeans and Americans, Brits and Americans, business and private sector, government and the businesses together moving in those directions, I think are encouraging, because we really don't have very much choice but to start trying to make some serious progress in those areas. And then I think perhaps a little more, perhaps obviously, I should say a little bit about some of the other more traditional foreign policy challenges which the international community has got to face up to at the beginning of 2013. And we certainly, as amongst the closest allies of the United States, look forward very much to working with the new economic, foreign, security policy team, which President Obama has put in place as part of his second team. We know John Kerry very well. We know Chuck Hagel very well. We know John Brennan very well, Jack Lew, and there are other appointments to be made. Of course, these are all still subject to Senate confirmation, and no foreigner could possibly dream of anticipating the decision on the confirmation process. Nevertheless, the President has made his intentions clear. We welcome it. We look forward to continuing the very close partnerships that we have all enjoyed in the past. And by God, we need it, because if we look around the world at the big global foreign policy challenges which are out there, we can't do any of this stuff on our own. Nobody, not even the United States, is able to do that. There's a lot of rather irresponsible talk of declinism and whether the United States is no longer interested in playing a global role, or whether it's lost interest in its traditional alliances in Europe and only interested in parts of Asia, wants to take a back seat. I think all that is grossly, in my view, exaggerated. I think the United States is still the indispensable partner, is still the strongest, most prosperous and best protected of the democracies that we have, and without the United States input, very few of these things can be achieved. But personally, given the amount of opprobrium which the United States has attracted sometimes in the past for being out front and taking the lead, I don't bear you any kind of grudge for saying, okay, you guys, you can share the burden. Our fellow allies, fellow Europeans, we're still ready to provide input, firepower, influence, leverage, but we're not going to be on our own, and we're not going to be singled out if things go wrong. That's seems to me a pretty sensible bit of pragmatism, speaking purely personally. But the key thing is that the United States remains an absolutely critical ally for everything that we're trying to do at the international level. What are the headlines? Well, I could run through 15 different potential or actual international crises which we need to think about in 2013. I'll just select a small number of those which are front and center on the international agenda. One, of course, right now has to be Syria, which I think is a shamefully sad story, in that although Syria is a sovereign country and it is responsible, and its own regime is responsible for its actions, I think we all wish there was more that we could do to stop the human suffering. 60,000 people killed so far, perhaps 100,000 civilian casualties by the end of 2013 if we're not able to bring to an end between us what's going on in Syria. Of course, there aren't any easy answers. If there were, we would have implemented them. If it was like Libya, we might have found that the Security Council would have authorized international action, although the Security Council these days has not been as ready to authorize any sort of international action on Syria as it was in the case of Libya. And there are lots of differences. But we have all made very clear that the legitimacy of the Bashar al-Assad regime is over, that it is time to move, and that the longer this mess goes on, the greater the risk of sectarian bloodletting and settling of scores, in which a lot of minorities as well as majorities of the population could easily be dragged in, with overflow effects into neighboring countries that we all care about, like Lebanon, like Jordan, like Syria, like Israel. So I think that is up there at the top of the list. It certainly exercises my own Prime Minister, who wishes there were more that we could do, in addition to what we are all already doing to try to support, guide, mentor the opposition elements and try to promote a transition which will bring to an end the suffering. But we haven't got any obvious and easy answers. If we had, we would have already implemented them. Then there is Iran, which is out there, has been for a number of years, primarily because of a nuclear program which all the evidence suggests is military and therefore threatens the region, threatens to unleash a proliferation of weapons of mass destruction around the region if it is not stopped. Lots of work has gone into this so far. So far, we have not been able to discourage the Iranian regime from going ahead with a military nuclear program. The President of the United States has been very clear that living with an Iranian bomb is not a policy option that he's prepared to contemplate. So we've got to find ways of ensuring that it doesn't become a nuclear power. The diplomatic path is, I think, by far the most preferable solution. That's what we're all pursuing. That's what we'll continue to do. Twin track, outreach, readiness to discuss and negotiate if the Iranians are ready to do so, but meanwhile ratcheting up the effect of sanctions, which are having a great deal of effect, and I think have probably gone further than many in Tehran expected. If none of that works, we're going to have to think of other options. The President of the United States has said nothing is off the table. My Prime Minister has said the same thing. But I think we all feel very, very strongly that resorting to military action is very much an option of last resort. And we need to test to destruction, if I can put it like that, the negotiating option, the peaceful way of solving this problem, partly because it's the best way of getting to the end of the issue and solving it if we can, but partly because if we do end up having to take military action, whoever it is, it will be essential if we are to carry our own populations, our own taxpayers, the international community, the Arab street with us to have shown that we have exhausted every alternative. I think that's a top priority. I welcome the fact at a purely personal level that if Senator Kerry is confirmed as Secretary of State, that he is somebody with immense knowledge of these issues, of the region, knows a lot of people, and I'm sure will be a key player in the efforts that we have to make together in the coming months to try to deal with that problem. And then still in the same region, we've got other things that won't wait. We have got the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. We have all spent countless years on this for decades trying to sort it out without adequate progress. And I've lost count of the number of times when experts have said I'm sure Ambassador Georgiana said the same thing. Time is running out for a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. Well, guess what? In 2013, time really is running out, and we all feel that it is time to see whether we can get this solved. Not for one reason or another, because you are on Israel's side or on the Palestinian side, because those people who care about the security and the prosperity and the survival even of Israel as a Jewish state, as well as those who care about Palestinian rights to a legitimate existence in their own country, both camps and those of us who care about both feel that this has to be resolved, otherwise on both sides, from the point of view of Israeli interests as well as Palestinian interests, there is a real risk of things taking such a turn for the worse that we won't be able to go back to the broad parameters of a political settlement that we all know about and which we've come very close to achieving in the past, based on basic elements that are widely known. So we'll see. We in Europe have been saying in public that we look very much to the United States to make a new international initiative led by America, because America is the indispensable power in this, which would be fully supported by the European powers and, I believe, by much of the Arab world, to see whether we can finally get a solution to this problem. I think that would be enormously valuable. I think it would also make the management of the risk of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in that region, including in Iran, a great deal easier to sort out if we could make progress on that. And then there's another subject which is in our minds today, not least because President Karzai is at the White House talking to President Obama more or less as we speak, and that's the whole complex of Afghan-Pakistan issues. That's been with us now for 12 years almost. It's twice as long as the Second World War lasted. It is something which it's time that we brought to an end, and we've got a strategy for bringing that to an end at the end, pretty much anyway, at the end of 2014. And I think it's on course. The basic elements and to some extent the timetable has been agreed in international meetings in Lisbon and in Chicago over the last year or two. We are not going to end up creating a sort of wonderful, perfectly formed Western democracy that the rest of us have spent centuries evolving and putting together in our own societies. But if I can just quote my own Foreign Secretary on this subject, we're not going to leave behind some perfect country with a perfect government, but I think we can leave behind an Afghanistan that is strong enough to stop it once again becoming a haven of terror. And I think Leon Panetta yesterday was saying something similar about our firm belief that we are now in a position to leave behind a sovereign and stable Afghanistan capable of looking after its own security. It remains a challenge because we're talking about the bulk of the combat forces provided by the coalition leaving Afghanistan at the end of 2014, and we need to make sure that we get everything in place between now and then. But we also need to keep a very close eye on what's happening next door, and it's distressing to see that in Pakistan, a country which I think is increasingly involved with the rest of us in working towards durable solutions of the problem, including on the Taliban front in Afghanistan, that what we are seeing is an outbreak of intersectarian, inter-Islamic violence, with suicide bombers attacking the Hazara Shia inside Pakistan for whatever reason, whether this is Al-Qaeda, whether this is other people trying to stir up sectarian trouble inside Pakistan, I don't know. I think that what we have to live with in the context of all those Middle Eastern issues that I touched on, but also some of the terrorism that we experience in those countries and more widely, is that, alas, for reasons of opportunism or related to governance or related to uncertainty created by certain military conflicts, there is evidence of a certain amount of civil conflict within the Muslim family, if you like, of the world, between Shia and Sunni and different groups, minor groups within each part of that community, if you like, of Islamic beliefs. More and more showing an intolerance towards each other. It was looking a lot better in Iraq, but there have been relapses. We've now got these latest worrying incidents in Pakistan, not new, but looking a bit worse. We've seen it in other parts of the world. I do think that if we could make progress on some of the intractable international issues which affect our friends in the Islamic world, it ought to become easier to try to manage the differences, which for a very long time were simply theological. They were never violent, they were never sectarian, they were not as bad as this between Shia and Sunni and between different branches of the Shia and Sunni Islam. If there's a role for the international community in that, I think it probably is in trying to solve some of those outstanding issues which fuel that discord and which have unleashed the rivalries and the tensions between those different parts of the Muslim faith. So I don't want to end on a gloomy note, but there are some big challenges out there. I think that the international community together, under, in most cases, a real degree of United States leadership, has to get on with this stuff. 2013 is a year when the ones that I've touched on will not wait. They can't be put off until after somebody else's election in a year or two's time. They are linked to the prosperity agenda. They are linked to our ability to get people back to work, to get our economies growing again, to get people having the confidence to invest in different economies, whether it's our own domestic economies or whether it's overseas investment in many of these countries which desperately need economic activity for their future survival and cannot just remain dependent on handouts, which in too many cases don't actually solve the problem and in some cases end up creating either a habit of dependency or in some ways worse. In other words, the money gets stolen or diverted for the wrong kind of purposes. So I think these issues are all linked. At the beginning of 2013, we certainly, the Brits, look forward to using the G8 presidency I touched on, but also our very special relationships with so many of our partners, both in Europe and here in the United States, to try to make some progress in these areas. We certainly will be doing our best, and I'm absolutely certain that the new team, which the President's putting in place on the national security front in Washington, are going to be up for it, and we look forward to working with them. Mr. Ambassador, there's some preliminary thoughts, lots of stuff that I haven't touched on, but perhaps just sketching out one or two of those challenges may be of value in setting the scene for some questions or a little bit of discussion with members of your audience. But thank you all for being here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for that excellent tour d'horizon. We'll now open the question and answer session. I believe we're experimenting for the first time with some questions from Twitter as well. I don't know how that's going to happen, but I may be informed. I don't have my iPhone with me. So the floor is open for questions and comments. We have two standing microphones here in the middle. Please go to the microphones, whoever has a comment or a question. We have. Please identify yourself.
My name is Doug Corbett. I read in The Economist the unsurprising enthusiasm of The Economist for these transatlantic trade agreements, and I'm wondering, is that isolated to those editorial offices, or is the same kind of excitement in Europe, and are you detecting that in the United States government? Because it seems, as you said, it's low-hanging fruit.
As I tried to say, I think there is very widespread support now for this idea. When my Prime Minister began talking about it 8-9 months ago, there was a certain amount of tooth-sucking. Well, you know, we tried the Doha process, we tried the multilateral trade negotiations, it didn't go anywhere. We don't want to start again if we're going to end up in a cul-de-sac. Let's take stock, let's look at this, let's seek the views of the high-level group of experts, which is what we're doing, and which is about to report. There has been some quite useful clearing of the undergrowth. There were some outstanding and rather tedious technical disputes between the Europeans and the Americans to do with stuff like live hogs and lactic acid and agricultural import restrictions in the opposite direction. All this stuff has actually been cleared away, and I think it's created a sense of confidence. And certainly our friends and colleagues in other European capitals, in Paris and Berlin, in Brussels and in Rome, and as I said, many of the stakeholders here in America seem to be, if not excited, because this stuff doesn't happen from one day to the next, it's going to require a lot of hard work, but seem to be convinced that this is now the right way forward and that the stars are sufficiently aligned, including such things as agricultural prices and the need for us to start setting some new global standards for certain technologies technologies, which if we don't do it, we the West, then guess what? Other people in Asia are going to do it for themselves, and we're going to be playing catch up. So let's get ahead of the game. Let's start getting some new life into our economy, and let's start reasserting some global leadership.
Good. I believe a student from Rice.
Yeah, my name is Chris Keller. I'm a senior here studying political science. Thank you for being here. My question is about the future of the welfare state, both in Europe and also here. And I was wondering if you could give a little more detail about some opportunities for leadership, maybe from Britain or from the United States, that you might see as to ways we can make that a more sustainable part of our economy and government. Thank you.
I think it's a very tricky question to answer. We start from very different points of departure. I remember listening to a debate about Obamacare during the campaign, and there was somebody who was so frustrated by what was going on with the socialization of healthcare in America that he said, if we go down this path, we'll be like all those bloody Brits whose teeth fall out at the age of 35. I do know what he means, but... and I wouldn't wish that on anybody, but it is an indication of the different perceptions, if not the different realities. Here in America, you spend twice as much on healthcare as we do. You spend 17% of your GDP, and the statistics suggest that you're going to be spending 25 to 30% if nothing is done to deal with costs and affordability over the next decade. Personally, I'd have thought that was an awful lot of your national wealth to spend on healthcare. And I'm not wholly convinced by some of the television commercials that I see from drugs companies telling me I've got things I've never heard of and I need to tell the doctor to prescribe drugs I don't need for a condition that I didn't think was a problem. So, maybe there's a degree of inflation in healthcare which is not familiar to those of us who live the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. But, our system is different. Ours was set up by the state in order to provide what we rather optimistically called a land fit for heroes after the Second World War. We wanted people to have an education. We wanted them to have a retirement. If they had no money, we wanted them to have healthcare. It has become unaffordable. And so we are bearing down on costs at the same time as costs of providing healthcare are rising, and the number of years we all live is getting longer and longer. It's a very difficult thing to deal with. We're doing various initiatives within our National Health Service for more value for money. We're driving down the costs of the drug companies, and we're trying to ensure that the state-run healthcare system provides healthcare that's needed rather than is an optional extra and doesn't really have to be done. It's very difficult to do. We're getting rid of bureaucracy, we're saving costs, we're improving it all the time, and we're doing a degree of choice and a degree of introducing some private sector activity, as we are indeed in education, trying to break down the barriers between private and public in order to give people a better service at a lower cost and with more choice. Here in America, it seems to me the choices you're facing are rather different, the challenges. You've got to deal with affordability. You've got to deal with access. We don't have a problem of access, but you do. You've got 35 million people who don't have access to the world's finest healthcare. And you've got to deal with rising costs. So I think we've both got similar challenges, but we come at it from a different position. I think it's one of the biggest challenges facing public servants in both of our countries, sometimes at state level, sometimes at federal level. Here in America, in the United Kingdom, it is in London, it's at the capital, it's at the national level that we have to deal with it. We do compare notes. We have got specialists talking to each other about how best to improve the service, lower the cost, and improve the accessibility to affordable healthcare. And there are some things we can learn from each other, but I think the fundamental differences are unfortunately quite considerable. We're trying to do the same thing, but from different departure points and with different resources at our disposal.
Hello, my name is Alex Buckles, and I'm a sophomore studying at Wake Forest University. Looking towards this summer, I'm planning on going to Azerbaijan to research oil development in the region in relation to the fragile geopolitical situation. I was wondering if you could speak on the political and economic importance of the Caspian Sea region for the U.S. and Britain.
Thanks for the easy question.
You could refer this to your Consul General.
I could, but that would be an admission of defeat, even if he knows more about it than I do. a couple of thoughts on that. The short answer is that I think the Caspian region is of immense importance in terms of supplies and energy security for Western consumers. Perhaps here in the United States, as you develop more and more indigenous production, both of oil and of gas, it's going to be less crucial. But the pipelines that come from the Caspian region, either through Russia or increasingly down through Turkey and then across into continental Europe, are very, very important for us, partly because we shouldn't be too dependent on single-source suppliers like Russia, and partly because it's important to the prosperity of that region. And a BP-led consortium, of course, was the one which built, and it's now flowing successfully, the first Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, which brings oil from the Caspian Sea down to the Mediterranean. There are additional gas pipelines which need to be built from that region, and we were very pleased recently that some rather complicated negotiations on Capitol Hill allowed there to be exemption from sanctions legislation because there are some Iranian shareholdings in some of those consortia. So a lot is happening in that area. I think it's very necessary, both for energy security and supplies and keeping the price down. And I think if you go to Azerbaijan, you will find that they are very excited by the prospects and very keen to ensure that there is yet more investment in Azerbaijan, in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and even to some extent, although that's in a square bracket at the moment, the bits of the Caspian which are under Iranian control. Eventually, when we can have a political settlement and sanctions can be lifted, there's a lot that we could do with the Iranian zone of the Caspian Sea as well. So have fun in Azerbaijan, and I think you will not be disappointed by the importance of the hydrocarbons industry there.
I originally wanted to ask you about the Scottish
Could you
referendum.
identify yourself?
Oh, sorry.
Identify yourself
Oh,
first.
yes, my name's Shane Kidwell. I originally wanted to ask you about the Scottish referendum for independence, but there's one pink elephant in the room. If we're going to talk about international challenges, there's a country that hasn't been mentioned yet, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, and that, of course, is China. You know, as China gets concerned about the U.S. and the international community trying to constrain it, and then the neighbors are concerned about it trying to expand its territorial control and territorial influence. How does the international community address that? How does the U.S. and Great Britain specifically address that? And any general thoughts you have on China and its role in the international community?
I didn't mention China as one of the immediate challenges because it's not one of those things which is, fingers crossed, about to blow up in our faces. But you're right to say that it's a very important issue. There has been a certain amount of, I think, unnecessary fussing in some of the European capitals about whether the great pivot to Asia by United States diplomacy means that we are no longer loved and appreciated in Europe as we should be. I think this is an unnecessary concern. We're all paying much more attention to Asia, so we should be. China is the second biggest economy in the world and continuing to grow very fast. We need China to assume its international responsibilities and not to be looking inward upon itself and making trouble, rather than working collectively with us for greater global prosperity and stability. So I think we have to engage with China. The administration in this country has done a great deal of that. My own government does a great deal of that. And we are engaging with them on a bunch of different things. Some of it's about political development, human rights, rule of law. Some of it's about foreign policy issues. We'd love to see the Chinese a bit more supportive in what we are, together with the other permanent members of the Security Council, trying to do with the United Nations, making as much progress as we would like. We need to engage with them on a bunch of economic issues like rare earths and the Chinese policy of buying up oil, gas, and coal reserves in different parts of the world. There's lots of stuff that we need to do with them, and I think the right policy is to engage, to embrace, to talk to them, and to get them to have a stake in our own economic success and in the stabilization of the parts of the world where they've got as much at stake as we have. So I think it's not an immediate instant crisis. That's kind of why I didn't put it on my top 4 or 5 list of things to worry about right now, but I think it is a very important issue. I don't think it's an issue where we are rivals. I think we are all pulling, broadly speaking, in the same direction. Sometimes we're healthy competitors in terms of contracts that we want to gain. We have the same interest in persuading the Chinese to open up their public procurement markets so that we can sell to them in the same way that they are all selling to us. But there's a lot more that can be done. The United Kingdom, for example, invests 120 times more dollars in the United States economy than China does. The Chinese are still beginning in terms of their potential role in the international economy. They're buying up here, they're buying up there, they're making investments. Sometimes we need to ask ourselves some very searching questions about the reasons for that. But I think the more that we can bring them into the global international economy, the better that ought to be for our broader interests. On Scotland, I would just say, what do I say? I say about Scotland to the Scots, we love them dearly, we hope they will stay. They will have their right in a referendum to say whether they wish to remain part of the United Kingdom or not. And we need to establish the rules, the questions, the timing pretty soon, because the uncertainty, I think, is not really good for anybody. But the policy of the United Kingdom government is that we hope very much that the United Kingdom, sorry, that was nearly a Freudian slip, the United Kingdom will remain intact, and that the Scots will decide in their wisdom they want to remain British. But it will be up to them. There will be a referendum, and we will see what happens. My guess is that most of the mainstream political parties, if not all of them, in the United Kingdom will campaign in favour of yes, please stay. The Scottish nationalists may well, I imagine, campaign the other direction, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. But those of us who work for the British government are clear, and I suspect those Scots who have played major roles in British government as politicians are probably equally clear that it is in their interest for Scotland to remain part of the Union.
Ambassador Chase Centimore.
Yes, welcome, Ambassador. Thank you for your remarks. You quoted the Foreign Secretary as saying that the objective of Britain and America and NATO's being in Afghanistan is to clear out a haven of terror. And we hope that that has been the case. But meanwhile, a potential new haven of terror seems to be created in Mali, an even larger and closer territory. Do you foresee any circumstance whereby NATO might go into Mali for the same reasons we went into Afghanistan?
You're right, Mali has become a real issue. Until not very long ago, it was a beacon of democracy in West Africa. I remember in a previous capacity, I used to go and see the President Konaré of Mali, who was democratically elected and who left office after his second term in accordance with the Malian constitution, and fresh elections were held, and Mali was doing well. It's a real tragedy that in a very short space of time, we've got to the stage where northern Mali is pretty much under control of Al-Qaeda affiliates. And all sorts of horrible things are going on, including kidnapping of Westerners in that country, which we now have to deal with. It's a very big country. I think territorially it's 2.5 times the size of France, Mali. Its access is very difficult. My guess is that absent something as catastrophically awful as 9/11, which I think left the United States and 35 other countries of the international community in no doubt, but that we had to go to Afghanistan to root out Al-Qaeda. My guess is that the international community will be very cautious about getting directly involved. I've seen that French Consul General is here, France is watching very carefully and has made some very helpful remarks about its readiness to act if that is what people in Mali would like and if that looked like being the right way forward. Mali is, of course, a French-speaking country. France has a traditional relationship which is of enormous importance. The United States is also watching carefully, as are the rest of us. I think we're not at the stage of looking at NATO doing anything major, certainly not in terms of boots on the ground at this point, but there are a number of ways in which I hope we can provide some support and see whether there's different ways in which we can collectively try to stop the rot and certainly begin to eradicate the threat of terrorism, which is particularly present in the north of the country, and which is there at the moment, which threatens other countries in the Sahel region, and indeed could, God forbid, become another breeding ground for the kind of Al-Qaeda activity of which we are all too well aware used to be the case in Afghanistan and has sometimes looked like it was developing in Somalia, which is why we have been so heavily engaged in Somalia to considerable effect, I might add. I think we're making progress there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you.